This episode is sponsored by our friends at Ycharts. A typical day in the life of a financial advisor calls for back-to-back client meetings, juggling portfolio management, and the consistent desire to improve client relationships. Ycharts report and proposal tools could be the missing piece to help you effectively handle these time-consuming tasks. Now more than ever, clients want to hear from their advisors. And with user-friendly templates at your disposal, generated impactful client reports can be easily integrated into your everyday routine, helping you free up time and focus on what matters, enhancing client interactions and growing AUM. I've said it before, but almost every post I put up includes charts from Ycharts because, look, they're really simple, they're really pretty, and it takes almost no time to create them. So join the thousands of users who rely on Ycharts by leveraging personalized proposal reports to truly showcase your value add. Click the link in the show notes to start your free Ycharts trial and tell them I sent you. All right, hello and welcome to yet another Value Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Walker. If you like this pod, it would mean a lot if you could rate, subscribe, review wherever you're watching or listening to it. With me today, I'm happy to have on for the first time, Paul Cerro. Paul is the founder, I'm just going to call it the Cedar Grove Empire, since you've got so many different Cedar Grove stuff going on there. But Paul, how's it going?
Yeah, not bad. But yeah, I appreciate you calling it an empire. Hopefully it ends up becoming that one day.
How many different things are part of the Cedar Grove Empire at this point?
So, I mean, there's the holding company, which is the Cedar Grove Capital Holdings. And then there's Cedar Grove Consulting, which is just for me to be able to do offside consulting work. And then there's also the Cedar Grove Capital Management, which is what you've been reading about for research / the investing portion of everything. So there's a few things going on right now, but hopefully we'll see how big that eventually becomes the next 5 or 10 years.
Cool. Well, before we start talking about all of that, just a reminder to everyone, nothing on this podcast is investing advice. That's always true, but maybe particularly true today because we're going to be talking about a company that it's got a decent market cap now, 250 million-ish. But, if we had been talking 9 months ago, this was a penny stock that's run up on some enthusiasm and everything. So it would have been very small. It's still quite small, a little bit more on the liquid side. So people should just remember, please, that comes with a lot of extra risk. Please do your own work, consult a financial advisor, keep all of those risks in mind. I definitely encourage you to read the 10K here because it lays out a lot of those risks pretty clearly. But anyway, Paul, the reason you kind of reached out and we wanted to get you on the show is the company today is Red Cat. The ticker is RCAT. And you had an interesting event-driven trade on them, which the stock has started to work, even though the event hasn't kind of fully played out there. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll turn it over to you. What is Red Cat and why are they so interesting?
Yeah, so Red Cat, so I was actually brought onto this by another fellow Twitter analyst or whatever you want to call it. I don't know how you label people like that. But anyway, I initially found the idea on Twitter, and it just really caught my eye because
was it Mike with a bunch of maybe his phone number behind it?
It was Mike. Yeah. Yep. So I know because I DM'd him about it because I just wanted to ask questions because context. I'm very big on defense in general, defense spending, weapons contractors, etc. So in that nature, you're kind of spending more time on the big boys, right? Your Lockheed Martins, your General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, etc., or in Raytheon. So when I was reading his post, it was about a little guy. I was like, oh, how little is this guy? And then you look at it, it's microscopic little if you're trying to compare the big boys to what's going on with Red Cat. So, I DM'd him, asking a bunch of questions, and I decided hey, if this is, I already know what the general thematic direction is for defense spending, and not just the US, but the world. Let me see what I can deter from his original analysis, which I ended up spending the whole weekend on. And in my original research, when I posted it, I drew a comparison to that one guy from Always Sunny in Philadelphia who's going crazy, combining all the red lines everywhere as if he's trying to draw some murder mystery crime scene thing. And when I went through it, I spent the whole weekend. I was so hyped up on caffeine, and I found out in my own, I guess, understanding what the numbers are and et cetera for these contracts, these weapons contracts that Red Cat, who specializes in drones, was going for. And I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And that's when I kept going deeper and deeper and deeper into it. But to sum it up, it's Red Cat Holdings is a US-based drone manufacturer, an unmanned, I should specify that, unmanned drone manufacturer. So they're the people who create those little drones that you can kind of maybe even see comparable to DJI. but they have military purposes. And their whole trade is essentially them benefiting from a US Army contract that at the time of my post was worth multiples of the entire market cap. And they were chosen to be one of the last two people to potentially win this contract. So the more I dove into it, the more I checked the numbers, the more I looking at the capabilities of Red Cat, it's got more and more interesting to me. You know, it's one of those trades where it's not solely dependent on them winning this contract, but the upside is mainly driven from this contract because at the same time, their core business is still growing. So there was a factor of like, okay, my downside is limited because the core business is still growing. But if any investor on the long side is right, they're going to be right big. And I felt like that was a pretty good risk reward. So that's why I ended up taking that trade and writing up the research and posting it.
So I guess a few things. A, I should just note to people, I'm going to include a link to Paul's write-up on this in the show notes. B, I should note to people, you can go look on the Red Cat website and see their investor relations deck. And if you do, I have to say the CTO here has a just absolutely pitch perfect mustache. You really got to give him credit for that. It's not a huge mustache. You're not. It's just like very tight, and I think people should be aware of that and all the investment implications there. But let's talk. So I want to come back to the contract in a second. But
yeah,
you mentioned, hey, defense. You're big into defense spending. Like when I just look at Red Cat, and they have an off-cycle fiscal year, but if I look at their financials, yep, they spend $5 million a year on R&D, and they're making drones. And I just look at that and say, hey, okay, cool. Drones, contracts. Like, why are these guys the ones? Forget this particular contract, but why isn't Lockheed, like $5 million is a rounding error to Lockheed? It's not like this technology can be that proprietary. So why are these guys like even relevant?
Yeah. So to answer that question more fully, I would need to take a step backwards to answer that question. So broadly speaking, it's not a secret these days that there are some tensions between the West and China, Russia, North Korea, etc. Right? It's unfortunately becoming a more geopolitical, I guess, tit for tat situations right now, at least as far as economically, right? But then there's a lot of worry that could spill over into further instability, which would then result in direct confrontation of armies. It's this modern day and age isn't like World War II anymore. It's not like Korea. It's not like Vietnam. You're not sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers head to head anymore and trying to take like one hill, like in Korea or something like that, right? Modern warfare has really, really developed the future of what combat will look like without actual boots on the ground, if not necessary. And so, like, what does that mean, right? So Russia kind of really put that into perspective when it just invaded Ukraine, right? Everybody thought Ukraine was going to fold. Honestly, I was one of them, and luckily they haven't yet, which is great. But the real point is how unprepared the West is on a military basis for the global instability that's happening and will continue to happen. So the broad-based theme here is that if they need to develop weapons, it's not just going to be boots on the ground. It needs to be weapons that can be used from deep within your own country that you don't have to be within a line of sight with you and me right now. Better weapons with vehicles, with aircraft, with missiles, with ammo, with reactive armor. Like there's a whole list of laundry list of things. So when it comes to the broad-based spending, NATO, who's going to be a very big part of this play, has been very much reliant on America to be its sharp end of the knife on things, right? We were spending, almost $1 trillion, almost $900 billion on defense, more than the next 26 countries combined. And they were always relying on us, even other countries were. And then unfortunately, the time has come where America's like, hey, we really just can't be the only ones who keep spending money, because if push comes to shove, if we, hypothetically speaking, if we go to war with Russia for some reason, we can't be the only ones being able to do that, right? You guys spend money. So there's been this huge uptick since 2022 of these NATO countries who are supposed to be spending 1% of their GDP already, but haven't, that are now really ramping up. So you have a general shift in overall, I guess, worldly views of how dangerous the future is going to become, or could become, I should say. And so there's a whole like increased level of defense spending, broadly speaking, US, NATO, African countries, East Asian countries.
I don't think anybody would disagree with anything you just said, right? But that's
Right.
overall, right?
Yep.
Like that's the rising tide. And
Yep.
maybe a rising tide lifts all boats, but that rising tide, like that would make sense for why you buy Lockheed Martin. That would make sense for why you
Yep.
buy a bunch of, but I guess my question would still be like, these guys, a 5 million R&D budget to make drones, like how were they even one of the last two for this big contract? Or like, how are they even competing? Because again, it's a rounding error. It seems like this should be something that's getting scooped up by a bigger player or a medium-sized player. Like, how is this kind of minnow in here? What's unique about their drones? Why are they even involved in this?
And that's the real difference, because when you have like an increase in defense spending, it's this thing that's going to naturally go into its existing programs. So the split here between we'll highlight just the drone part. You already have the big boys who handle like the bigger drones, right? These are like what you and I have probably grown up knowing as like the Predator drones, right? Who carries the sidewalk, like the missiles that are on the wings, and they can hit, Al Qaeda in a cave from, a couple miles up in the air, from 200 miles away from a guy who's controlling it in like somewhere in Iraq or even Nevada, right? Those are what the big boys handle, because those require more R&D, more spend, more manufacturing. They carry heavier payloads. They have a proven track record of making those heavy hitter drones, for instance. When it comes to Red Cat, right? Ukraine basically showed the world that they could do devastating damage if you just had a simple drone that you could almost kind of like go to your Best Buy and arm it, right? So when you're talking about a small R&D budget, which is quite literally a rounding error, wouldn't even show up on like Lockheed's or income statement. It's mainly because there is a direct need based on a proof of concept that smaller drones en masse can accomplish a lot versus spending the 5, 10, 15, $20 million per drone attached with the payload, depending on what the situation is. So when you're talking about the need for it, you have the big boys handling the big things. You have the little guys handling a lot of the little things. And the real push there is that there's a whole, based on the recent acts that were signed into play, we're actually trying to stay away from foreign-made weaponry. And I would say it's kind of like for obvious reasons, it's kind of rhetorical of why you don't want a foreign power making your own weapons. And this is why the Americans are actually pushing up American-made weaponry. So they're promoting the Red Cats, they're promoting the Skidios, they're promoting a couple hundred other military manufacturers. Anduril is one of them, right? Very hot in the BC space. AeroVironment, right, with their suicide switchblade drones. So there's so many companies that are now rising up to fill the need of what the future of warfare looks like from a drone capability, and then also filling in the gaps of what would have been a foreign power, aka China, making these drones and making these drone components, so that America and its allies don't have to worry about someone else having leverage against them when it comes to weapons.
That makes sense. Just for people, so the drones, as you said, these are small drones. Like if you think about one of those drones, it's like a square with 4 legs sticking out, and each of the legs has like a little rotator right on the top, like that. That's kind of that is the front image of their investor day, right? But when you think about these drones, so what are the capabilities of these drones that they're making? And then the real thing I want to ask is, if you and I were, they're probably not going to sell one to us, but like how much are they charging for one of these drones, just to put it in context? Because as you said, a Predator drone, millions and millions of dollars. Like how much are they charging for one of these?
It's actually not much. So what was part of this contract, the initial price when it was coming to the first tier was looking at about $20,000 a pop. It's not much, right? When you talk about the big scheme of things. Now with, unfortunately, what's been happening in Ukraine being tested on the battlefield, the V1 versions are not holding up very well on the battlefield. They're getting shot down left and right. So in order to make them more combat effective, they have to increase the specs, increase the capabilities of not being jammed, increase the capabilities of not being, shot out of the sky, et cetera, et cetera. It increases the cost. So when you look at it, you're looking at about $40,000 or $30,000 per drone now. which has the increased capabilities, which is part of the program. So it's not like you're going to Best Buy buying your $1,000 DJI drone, which is what Ukraine was basically doing in the beginning of the war. These are now filling what the increased needs are in a ever-changing combat environment, which it gets more and more expensive as time goes on because the capabilities will become greater and greater as time goes on and the battlefield changes.
Just so, do you have a specific number for how much these drones cost though? I'm just curious because I know they come down massively over time. That's going to kind of lead into my next question. Yeah, it's okay if you don't, but $20K to start, but I would guess it's way down by the time they fulfill the next contract.
Well, so the part two of the contract is actually a combination of part two, and it was originally part two and part three. So they've actually become one. And in that situation, that's where the new increased cost, which based on my estimates, and granted I've spent so much time trying to figure this out, is about $33,000 per drone.
Okay, 33.
Increase, 33,000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just when I'm thinking of these drones, because I remember a few months ago, and you still see this, like Ukrainians were literally building drones in their like backyard, just hundreds and hundreds. So why does the US government need like a $33,000 drone here versus, hey, why don't we go to Best Buy and buy, for $33,000, buy 300 of these drones, and then we'll install some tech and stuff on them. But what is it specifically about going with like a Red Cat versus kind of just going with that commercial drone and then just installing some tech onto it?
Oh yeah, because if you think about it from a cost perspective, what you just mentioned makes the most sense, right? You're getting more value for your buck. The problem there is deciding who your friends are, and I say that in the context of if you go and buy a DJI drone, DJI is a Chinese-made drone. And that's exactly what Ukraine was doing. They were going out and buying these $1,000, $2,000 drones to use as reconnaissance vehicles to scope out Russian positions, right? And then the problem there is you almost needed to trust who your host was in order to use them effectively. And unfortunately, the Chinese were not being very trustworthy with their products. And what I mean by that is there were actually every time a Ukrainian drone would go up, that was DJI, Chinese, there were reports that the Chinese would actually be sending Russia information about the whereabouts of who is manning these drones so that Russia would just, plop in some coordinates and drop a bomb on them, So there's a situation of where you can't even trust the people who make it for you because they're just ratting you out because they're actually not your friend.
No, and it makes total sense. Like, because kind of one of my worries, and I think you're addressing, but one of my worries is, the SpaceX thing where NASA would always use everything was custom NASA. And then SpaceX was like, why do we need a $30,000 custom space calculator on our aircraft? Let's just use a normal calculator. And like that turned out to work out fine. So I was kind of wondering, why, $33,000 drone versus a $100 drone. But I guess it does make some sense. Now, I'm sure you could get a US producer to mass produce these domestically for maybe 200 versus 100 in China, but you still might kind of want, if you're going to flood them with thousands, you still might want to know that it's proprietary, that who's making it, that you've got control of the network. Anything you want to add there?
Well, yeah, that's a big component, right? You got to be able to trust people, right? Especially when you're talking about weapons. Secondly, is the capabilities that keep changing just keeps adding to the price, right? You might need thermal imaging on a camera, right? You're not going to be using some $200-$300 GoPro attached to a DJI, right? Or whatever the stock camera is for DJI, right? You'll need thermal imaging. You'll need potentially infrared, being able to see like hopefully through thinner walls, right? The ability to have the radio frequencies not being jammed, right? That's how a lot of them were getting shot down because the Russians would basically just send out some telemetric beam that like shuts off their radio frequency, and then these drones would fall out of the sky because they can't connect to their to the driver, right? So they were falling out of the sky left and right. So the more capabilities that keep happening, the more expensive things naturally get. And you can actually, as an easy example, comparing the two, you can kind of almost see like, how old are you again, Andrew? I think you're like kind of similar to my age. I'm 30, so I imagine we're kind of in the same ballpark.
A little bit older than you. I think
whatever. We're both 30. We're both 30. But I'm sure you can imagine, like, when Operation Iraqi Freedom happened, Humvees back in the day were the most bare-boned vehicles with a 50 caliber machine gun on it. Over time, over the next 10, 15 years, Humvees became a very, very expensive piece of equipment because it got more and more upgrades added to it, right? To withstand IEDs, to have like reactive armor, to have this and that, et cetera. So over time, the prices are just going to naturally go up because the needs on the battlefield will just naturally change things, right? So the first contract being $28,000 a drone, second part of the contract being $33,000 a drone. There could be a future version that could be $50,000 a drone because we just don't know what the requirements will be a month from now, a year from now, 5 years from now that the U.S. military and its allies are going to need on the battlefield. And that's just the fact of life, unfortunately.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Ycharts. A typical day in the life of a financial advisor calls for back-to-back client meetings, juggling portfolio management, and the consistent desire to improve client relationships. Ycharts report and proposal tools could be the missing piece to help you effectively handle these time-consuming tasks. Now more than ever, clients want to hear from their advisors. And with user-friendly templates at your disposal, generated impactful client reports can be easily integrated into your everyday routine, helping you free up time and focus on what matters, enhancing client interactions and growing AUM. I've said it before, but almost every post I put up includes charts from Ycharts because, look, they're really simple, they're really pretty, and it takes almost no time to create them. So join the thousands of users who rely on Ycharts by leveraging personalized proposal reports to truly showcase your value add. Click the link in the show notes to start your free Ycharts trial and tell them I sent you. So let's go to this big contract we're talking about. This is the SRR contract. We can talk about the NATO contract later, so let's just put that to the side for now. But the big contract everyone get excited about is the SRR contract. You identified in your article originally, but then in the August earnings call, which I think got people really excited, they came out and said, hey, it's between us and one other person for the SRR contract. So I'll back up and just says, what is the SRR contract? We started talking about it, but let's just make sure we fully define what is the SRR contract and why would this be such a big deal?
Yeah, so the SRR contract is a U.S. Army short-range reconnaissance contract for supplying with unmanned drones that can fit in a soldier's backpack. It needs to be that small and that light so that if you and I end up going to the front line somewhere, we can just whip this thing out, have it fly out into the air, and then be able to provide reconnaissance for whoever troops are needed, right? That's essentially what it is. However, I don't want to make this seem like it's a Ukrainian war situation because it actually was a program that was pre-COVID. But because of COVID, like it actually was launched in 2018, but because of COVID, it was delayed. So there was a company who's called Cedar who won the first part of that contract. And unfortunately, they're the ones who made the drones that are being used in Ukraine that are getting shot down left and right. And it's not a fault to them. It's just the battlefield changes.
I mean, if you go, like, a lot of times I'll read the Institute for the Study of War. I like to read their daily recaps.
Oh, nice. Okay.
And just everything, everything you're saying is right? Like the Ukraine-Russian war is the first modern war. Postmodern war, 2020s war, they're learning so much from how drones, the internet, all this, they're learning so much from it. If you're saying, oh, they awarded this contract in 2018 and this stuff's getting shot down, that sucks. But guess what? It's a modern war. We've never tested or seen how these things work. So it's very much kind of what you'd expect. And you'd hope our leaders are learning from this modern war to prepare. Hopefully we don't ever have one, but our troops for whatever the next war is. That is what they should be doing.
Yep. And that's just the fact of life. I mean, I can't imagine anybody who actually will answer a question saying, I like war. I don't know anybody who says that, right? There's no winners in war, right? Yes, technically there is, but really there's not. And the problem here is that in the modern warfare modern battlefield of Ukraine right now, drones have really proven that most modern equipment that's not necessarily useless, but is not as dangerous as they once thought, right? There's articles that came out in the beginning of the invasion where they said that tanks might not even be useful anymore as line penetrating vehicles because they're getting blown up left and right from one person with a rocket launcher now. Last month, which blew my mind because it was caught on camera, and you maybe see it on your own time. There was a Russian attack helicopter. I think the price tag on that one was $12 or $14 million. A $2,000 suicide drone, flew into it and blew it up. The impact that a $2,000 drone can have on a $12 million piece of attack equipment is insanity, right? You can't lose $12 million vehicles left and right and expect to be able to sustain yourself in a war. It just doesn't work that way. But you can make a $2,000, $20,000, a $30,000 drone. And if I can think and take out a $12 million attack helicopter, that you're winning. All right. So it's really proving themselves in a situation like that. And that's why this reconnaissance program, I have to stay here because I don't want to get carried away. It's for reconnaissance. There are different programs that are attack drones or suicide drones, etc. But for the sake of this contract, it's just to be able to fit in your backpack for me to whip out on the front line and start spying on enemy positions. That's what it's for, just reconnaissance.
Yeah. Okay. So great. So that's sort of for SSR, short range reconnaissance. Let's talk about it. They come on the August call and they say, "Hey, we're one of two players left in this." Mm-hmm. I want to scope out two things. Number one, if they win, what are kind of the economics? But I guess the second thing is, like, they've come out and said it, but you mentioned you were digging through all these documents. Like, what have you seen in your due diligence that? Because to my knowledge, again, I only spent a day researching these in prep for the podcast. Yeah. I didn't like dig through the Department of Defense RFQs or anything. So, like, what have you seen to confirm that they are one of the last two, that they have a shot at winning this, all that type of stuff?
Yeah, so luckily we've known that they've been the last two for a while now. They just reiterated that on their recent call, like, hey, there hasn't been an announcement. We're still in the running. So, because everyone's basically that's the catalyst right now is. Are you in it still? Yes, no. And if you are, what's the timing, right? That's how we're all leaning towards. The interesting part is that with their reiteration of being in this contract still, they're estimating that by the end of September, they're hoping to hear back from the U.S. Army on a decision. They had their final submissions for the drones in May. So the U.S. Army throughout this whole time has been testing their drones along with their competitors, which is Skydio, who is the current incumbent. So they've been testing them out, and that's what they're hoping to get a decision by the end of Q3. The real part of my diligence is, so it's slightly annoying because your diligence can only go so far, right? Because when you're competing for these weapons contracts, you actually don't know what the final version is that they've submitted for these contracts, right? Because they're always going through iterations, right? Oh, you know what? If we might need to make this drone have flying capabilities and not just VTOL capabilities, right? Maybe it needs to have a 3-pound payload, not a 5-pound payload, or vice versa, right? Or maybe the imaging of this camera needs to be just a little bit better, or needs to incorporate this, et cetera, et cetera. So like things keep changing, so you actually don't know precisely. Hey, this drone is what was submitted, and now we can label that against this drone, which was submitted, because it's all confidential, right? The military does not advertise, what exactly its hardware is made out of and what the requirements are. So the unfortunate part is you are limited to what you can assume was submitted. However, what you can tell is that based on the prior versions, kind of who was doing a little bit of a better job prior to submissions. And as of right now, you can arguably say that Red Cat had a arguably better drone for what was needed, the next leg up for what was needed. The other point here that I want to label is that when it comes to weapons contractors, usually incumbents typically stay within the program. They've been picked once, they've been vetted. Yeah, they've been vetted. They've proven themselves to whoever general agreed to, sign off on the budget, etc. The problem here, which is very interesting in this case, is that Skydio, again, winning the first part, to no fault to them, their drones are not doing a very good job on the battlefield, right? So when you're talking about the ability to command that incumbent leverage, it's not looking so hot right now. And again, it's not because they didn't doing a good job. It's just because, you make drones for what you thought the battlefield was going to be, and it changes. So it's going in favor of Red Cat is, depending on how they, kind of portray and pitch themselves, it's like, hey, listen, you kind of gave this company a shot. They did their job. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. Why not go with us where, we have certain certifications that have been approved by the government as well. We've tested it and proved it that, the border patrol is buying them. NATO countries are buying them. Give us a shot, right? They're kind of arguing for that case. And that's kind of what helps shift the narrative of, oh, they actually might have a shot here because a little bit more can be on their side versus
Yep.
if it was, any other contract, they might not win it,
So let's say best case scenario, right? Red Cat wins this.
Yeah.
What do the economics of it look like if they win this contract? Like, I could say we're playing for a government contract, and it could be a $10 million per year contract, and be like, cool, this is a $200 million market cap company that doesn't move the needle. Or I can be like, hey, we're playing for the contract. It's a $10 billion contract. And be like, wow, it's a really big contract. Okay, cool.
Yeah. So the real meat and potatoes here is that it's about a 10-year contract. And each year, based on the budgetary outlays in their annual budgets, they kind of list out up until 2029 right now what the unit demand will be for these drones. So we can kind of estimate on a yearly basis what it's going to be. So it's not like an even number every year. It kind of ebbs and flows. But if you're assuming that the drone costs stay the same, you can kind of estimate what it's going to be like. The total value is just under $500 million. So when you're talking about a company that's trading for like half of that, one contract alone, granted it's over 10 years, was double what the company is right now, right? A little bit more. So big upside. The problem is, how does the market value that? Because you have a contract that you'd win that's worth multiples of what you're worth. How do you value that? And I gave out different scenarios of how that works.
One contract, you think if they win it, it's going to be about $500 million of revenue. Thinking about that correctly?
Yeah.
And over what time frame?
500, almost 500 million for 10 years. And that's just for the hardware and like the actual, replacement parts.
I was just looking at 500 million per year or in total over the contract?
Total. Yeah.
I guess that's what I was trying to hear of it, because 500 million revenue sounds good against a $200 million market company, right?
Yep.
But this is government contracted. Like, I haven't looked at Lockheed Martin in a while, but government contracted drone on a small scale. Like, what are the margins going to look like on that contract?
Yeah, they'll be profitable on it. I mean, they're already like reducing their cash burn already with the contract that they have. I don't know the specifics of what it will be like, but you're talking about each drone that you're still making is still going to be profitable for them, right? And if you're increasing the volume, which is exactly what's going to be happening here, that's one of the bigger points, I guess, from a structural balance sheet perspective, is that they're going to get a ton of money up front because they need to get money up front in order to start production of these. So their balance sheet's going to be more than capable of handling it. And then if you think about it, the longevity of the contract over 10 years, and they're making money on each drone just on this one contract, you're talking about a company that's going from, a small thing out of Utah to then becoming a really big player in what potentially be the future of drone marketing. So it's not so unfortunately I don't have the exact numbers. I don't know what the final iteration was for the drone that they submitted. So I don't know what the unit economics are, but from what they've hinted on their earnings call, it could be very profitable for them, should they win it.
So I guess what I worry about is, it sounds like a big number, and they win a government contract, right? But they win a government contract for a drone, which is, it's good work, but it's not the highest margin, most complex. Like, there's a reason they're bidding this out to smaller players. They win it, and let's say it's 50 million of annual revenue for 10 years. Like, that's a great revenue stream. You've got your foot in with the government. That's great proof of concept. You might make sense as an acquisition to someone who can just rip out all your G&A and just provide all that. But if it might be 50 million of revenue annually. It might be 6 million EBITDA, and it's a 200 million market cap company right now, right? So I'm kind of like, hey, the market cap at this point seems to be baking in a high probability of them not only winning this, but using this as the stepping stone to either a future acquisition or continued work, as you mentioned. Like, the Humvee starts out as the cheapest, and then you keep adding on. This starts out as cheapest, you keep adding on, maybe win another contract. And I threw a lot out there, but I guess I'm kind of wondering, the market is a competitive place. Yep. 2 months ago, this was a lot lower. Maybe the market had not a lot ascribed to this, but with the company coming and pounding the table and everything, is this really alpha opportunity here, or is this more, it's already baking in a kind of best case scenario in terms of them winning?
So when it comes to the actual contract, right, not much has changed in the sense of what that value of the contract would affect, how it would affect the valuation of the business as it did a month ago versus today. That's, in my opinion, that stayed the same. But what got interesting, which is why I put out a recent report on it, is that they announced a newer acquisition of a company called FlightWave. And FlightWave also makes unmanned drones as well. That was a recent acquisition that they made in June, I think it was. Maybe it was late May or early June. And what was interesting to me is that we didn't have any information related to that acquisition. They just said like, hey, cutting edge drone technology really rounds out our portfolio of of products within our drone company. There's no numbers really behind it of like what that can contribute. But on the earnings call, what was interesting is that the CEO, Jeffrey, he was saying that potentially for calendar year 25, which is their end fiscal year 25.
They're in it right now. It ends June 2025 or so. Yeah.
Right. So he was estimating anywhere from $10 to $20 million just from that product. So what got interesting for me is that if your confidence in the contract hasn't changed, right? That still stayed the same. The floor of what the valuation is without winning that contract has also moved up, because now we can assume what a future backlog could be for these drones in the coming years, right? So now we think about like your downside. It's a lot less, even though the stock has moved up, 50% in a month.
So what is the downside if they come out end of September and they say, hey, we gave it an honest effort. We think our tech was the best, but the government is going with the incumbent here, as they normally do. Like, what does the company look like in that scenario?
Yeah, so I mean, it's definitely going to be lower right now, but it's going to be if you weigh out the options, it's kind of like you're going to feel short-term pain, which is going to be probably reverting back to what you probably saw the prices about a month ago. But you have short-term pain, but the actual like core business is still growing, right? And that's going to be leading into the other programs that I know you mentioned in the beginning of our call about, was like the NATO programs, right? Or additional US military programs. So it's not just contingent on this one. It's just that this one is the only like live one that we can apply a hard number to, a semi-hard end date to, and figure out what the longevity is for that contract. That's kind of like why so much is leaning on this. But that doesn't mean it's the end all be all, because in the weapons contracting space, deals come in left and right all the time. Whether it's people in Ukraine, whether it's Germany, England, the Border Patrol has even bought their drones, right? That's just reconnaissance drones to watch the borders, right? So there's always going to be cases and deals coming in that we don't know about right now, which is what they've hinted about on the last call. But it's the most important one right now, which is the SRR contract. So it's not the end all be all. It's just the nearest term catalyst that we can apply some level of confidence to.
Let me ask it to you in a different way. How much of this to you is a binary where you are betting on SRR, them winning, and you think, the stock is undervalued once you start factoring in the SRR contract and all the bolt-ons and the add-ons and the proof point there, versus how much are you betting on, Red Cat in particular, their technology, their management team, their everything that they can, even if they don't win SSR, like this opportunity space is huge, and you think there's something unique about their technology management team and everything that they can go and can capture and continue to capture slices of this.
Yeah, I think it's hard because I try not to be biased, right? Because you live in America, right? You want to support your country and the abilities that the country has to defend itself. That means representing the companies that are American made, Red Cat being one of them. So there's a part of me that says, you know what? Like, I want to just believe that they can get the job done in the future, even if they don't win it, which I do believe they can. But as an investor, you don't want to have capital tied up because you want to wait for the hopes and dreams of what a company could be, 2-3 years down the road, right? So there's a function of like, I think I'm more in it as a binary trade, right? They either win it or they don't, right? If they win it, great. I make the additional alpha that I've outlined before, and then I'm out. Or if they don't win it, it's one of those things where, and I got to be honest here, depending on where the dust settles, might motivate me to either just cut my losses and move on, or stick it out, because if it's not that bad, it might be one of those things where, okay, great. Maybe the market's deciding that the future of this company was not contingent on this one contract, and that the future is still bright once they start announcing future contracts, right? So it's one of those things where I'm still navigating myself, but in the moment, it's pretty binary.
So we're talking August, let me make sure I have the day right, August 21st, right? The stock has, as you mentioned, it's around quite a bit. And most of that is they come out on the Q2, or sorry, not the Q2. They come out on their earnings call and they reaffirm everything about the contract opportunity. They mentioned the NATO contract, which we haven't really discussed everything. And most of that is the stock move there. So as we were talking, August 21st, with the stock at 3, if I had to be like, Paul, what do you think the odds in the stock price right now are that they win this contract versus kind of what do you think the odds are that they win this contract?
Yeah, no, I think the market is really pricing in that they're going to win. And it's an interesting point because I tweeted about it too. So in their transcript, they announced additional hires for G&A to fuel future growth, right? And if you look on their careers page, I think at the time that I tweeted about it, they have, I think, 29 or 30 open positions for the company. If you go to LinkedIn, the amount of people that are currently employed, at least on LinkedIn, was 23, I think. Or maybe it was like, maybe I'm reversed. Maybe it was like 30 and then 23. Either way, they're expecting to hire a lot of people, which you and I can, I guess, attest to, you normally don't do unless you're figuring in some type of future growth that would require that many people to nearly double your headcount, at least on LinkedIn, right? So it's one of those things where I think the market is pricing in what the commentary was on the transcript. They're also like digesting if they saw what I saw, right? With you improving headcount by double. Otherwise, why would you do that? And then if worse comes to worse, the fallback, the downside is not just the core company being okay, but also the NATO projects, the future US Army contracts like Replicator, et cetera. So I also the caveat too. I got in this a month ago, so like my downside is a lot more protected than if somebody were entered today. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's still not a good trade. It just means that the extra margin of safety probably isn't as well as it was a month ago. But that doesn't mean it's not as still exists.
Yeah, I guess my pushback would just be like, if I'm today looking at this with fresh eyes and saying, hey, well, the market is a competitive place. What is the alpha opportunity? And you're saying the market's already pricing in the contract, then it feels like there's not really, like if the market's already pricing in the contract, it's priced in, right? It feels like there's not really alpha if you're saying the market's got this priced in at this point.
Oh yeah, sorry. Let me redo that. So they're assuming that it's going to win, but they're not actually pricing in the actual like full value that at least I've estimated it to be. So while the market has moved up, was it 30% in 2 weeks, I think, or 20% in 2 weeks, something like that. I think it's 30%. The actual value that I've applied to this contract win is still 100% more than it is today. So even though,
I guess what you're saying is the market, even though the market is quite optimistic about this win, you think the market, I mean, I've certainly seen these before too, where it's like, hey, the market is pricing this win as a $10 million win, but it's a $30 million win because the market is underestimating our margins, or the market is underestimating how big the win is, or the market's underestimating the follow-on work. So that's kind of where you think the difference between you and the market is at this point.
Yeah, because I think based on that last earnings transcript or last earnings call, the math has changed, and the math has changed for the positive because the goalposts have been moved, right? I mentioned the FlightWave acquisition. Now we have hard numbers. They're estimated, but estimated numbers on what that backlog could be, right? So that increases the potential automatically. Then you have the ability of what they mentioned before, the NATO contracts that they said they're already in the running for, that will be decided by the end of the year. Then you have like Replicator program, which is a very crazy initiative that is arguably more important, but they're still being decided too. So when you think about, how much alpha you have left, because of that one call, the goalposts have moved upwards, which allows any investor, if they want to get in, to, again, limit their downside because more stuff is happening in the background, but that contract is still there. So while the more stuff is happening in the background, tack on the contract win, you're still looking at a healthy premium to what's going to be going on. The issue, again, is just what is the reality if they actually win it? And, push comes to shove, I think it's definitely over 50%, but, we'll see what actually ends up happening.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Ycharts. A typical day in the life of a financial advisor calls for back-to-back client meetings, juggling portfolio management, and the consistent desire to improve client relationships, Ycharts report and proposal tools could be the missing piece to help you effectively handle these time-consuming tasks. Now more than ever, clients want to hear from their advisors. And with user-friendly templates at your disposal, generated impactful client reports can be easily integrated into your everyday routine, helping you free up time and focus on what matters, enhancing client interactions and growing AUM. I've said it before, but almost every post I put up includes charts from Ycharts because, look, they're really simple, they're really pretty, and it takes almost no time to create them. So join the thousands of users who rely on Ycharts by leveraging personalized proposal reports to truly showcase your value add. Click the link in the show notes to start your free Ycharts trial and tell them I sent you. That's good. So people can go read the Q2 transcript if they want to do more diligence on this. And obviously, I've encouraged people to do diligence, do their own work on everything. That's how I start the podcast off. But I do just want to ask, so the company comes in the Q2 and they say, and you've alluded to it here, hey, not only are we up for this SRR, but NATO has a contract. And the NATO contract could be, from memory, I think they're pitching as it could be about 5 times the size of the SRR contract. And obviously, that seems very early stages. But I just want to ask real quick on the NATO contract, is there correlation with the SRR project, right? Because I could imagine a world where you say, yes, whoever wins the SRR contract is going to be by far in the lead for the NATO contract. I could also imagine a world where you say, no, whoever wins the SRR contract has no bearing on the NATO project. Like there's a legacy incumbent here. The US Department, like they contract on a lot of different areas. NATO might want to do a European-based person, or they might want someone separate than the US government for like, that might be good diversification discipline for them. So maybe RCAT's more likely to win it if they don't win this contract because they want to have like kind of systems that work together, but that aren't run by the same person. So I threw all the options at you there. Like, how would you think about that from the NATO perspective?
Yeah, so I think there's an immediate need for weapons right now, and then there's also a long-term need for weapons. And you never want to go to just one source for things, right? Like again, the big guys, they do certain things very, very well, and that's why the world will go to them for stuff, right? So if you go to Gel Dynamics, you usually go for an Abrams tank, right? If you want missiles that are well made, you go to Raytheon. As an example, right? They don't exclusively do that, right? They all kind of touch base and even like collaborate on things. But when it comes to drones, the need for drones right now is so abundant that you just have to be able to buy them from so many different places because the capacity constraints to be able to manufacture them, unfortunately, are limited right now. You can still ramp them up, but if you're talking about 15, 16, 17 NATO countries that are like, hey, okay, we all need drones right now, you can't just get it from one person. You literally just can't. So I love the example you brought up because their competitor right now, Skidio, so again, first part of the contract was not great. They did a very, very poor job. The most recent iteration that's on their website, which everybody can go check out, the Ukrainian military has already put in orders for them. So the Ukrainian military is already like, okay, hey, I know you screwed up the first time, but we like what you've done with the second iteration. We'll buy thousands of them. And then you have the ability for, that they actually took advantage of was like they actually hired a team specifically to be in Ukraine as a liaison to help them with the Skidio drones. I haven't heard anything from Red Cat doing that, but that's an example of like, okay.
I think Red Cat, sorry, I've got their deck somewhere. I'll try and pull it up. Red Cat has in their December deck, it is page, rats, I can't find it. Yeah. Red Cat has in their December deck. It's page 22. I'm looking at it now. They did send people over to a Ukrainian training facility to test some of their stuff. So Red Cat's certainly done something. And I mean, look, it's tough for me to tell anyone, hey, go participate in a war zone. But I guess if you're making drones or anything that's like on kind of the cutting edge, you need to get some experience over. You need to get some of it tested or learnings from Ukraine because again, that is the most modern war site. So they've definitely had a team over there. I think that was November 2023 is when the photo was taken. So yeah,
I think the difference is that the one is being used for testing, but then for Skidio's purposes, they actually have hired people to be stationed in Ukraine permanently, at least while that conflict is going on. So it's like same but different. But no, so it's the ability to be able to like contract out to multiple manufacturers because the capacity constraints are very much real, but the demand is even more intense. And then also, you never want to, if COVID's proven anything, you never want to have supply chain, hiccups if you're relying on one person, right? Because you never know what's going to change, and you don't want to be reliant on one thing, especially when it comes to combat. So that's why I think when it comes to the future, there's going to be a lot of winners in this space, mainly because innovation is going to be needed to be able to do this. The future conflicts don't just stop with Russia. The replicator program, which I mentioned in my article, is that that's the U.S.'s responses to China with what they believe will be an invasion of Taiwan in the next 2 to 3 years. And drones are a very, very, very important part of that, which is why they're spending over $1 billion on that one program.
Look, I think we've covered a lot. I just remind people this is a smaller company, 200 million-ish market cap. Obviously, there's a big binary, as Paul kind of discussed, that's coming up in the near future. So people should just, I'll include a link to Paul's article in the notes, but people should really keep that very heightened risk in mind and do their own work and all of that type of stuff. Paul, I just wanted to include that disclaimer, but we covered a lot here. Is there anything you think we should have mentioned that we didn't hit, or anything like we kind of glanced over that you think is worth mentioning here before we wrap it up?
Yeah, I think a few things. So one, the broad-based theme of defense spending is going to be going up and to the right. Again, it flows into different categories, drones being one of them. So even if you're just interested in learning about it, learning about these companies and learning about the weapons that they make is just a really cool topic to learn about if you're interested in that. So worst case scenario, you learn something cool. Best case scenario is if you decide to take the risk, right, which I'm not recommending anybody do unless you've done your homework. It can be a very rewarding bet, as long as you understand what the risks are, and there are risks here. But it's in either way, it's very interesting. The space is interesting. The companies that are operating it is interesting. It applies to all of us because it involves our security, it involves our safety. So take that for what it's worth, but it's interesting overall.
Perfect. That's a great way to wrap it up. I will wrap it up there. Paul, thanks so much for coming on. Again, there will be a link in the show notes, and looking forward to having you on in the future.
Yeah, thank you again.
A quick disclaimer: nothing on this podcast should be considered investment advice. Guests or the hosts may have positions in any of the stocks mentioned during this podcast. Please do your own work and consult a financial advisor. Thanks.